Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sukkah Daf Mem Daled. This week of learning is sponsored by Medina Korn in memory of her dear mother, Rosalie Katchen, Shoshana Rezel Bat Avraham, Yoshua Vebela Toiba, Zichrona Levracha, on her 21st year at site. Her kindness and grace, zest for life, delight in Torah study, and love for family and friends continue to inspire us every day. Yehi Zichra Baruch. Okay, we're going to start now. We were in the middle of this discussion about comparing Lulav and Arava, and what we basically ended up concluding. Why does Arava not override Shabbat when it falls out on the seventh day? Number one, we kind of said it never really does, but there was an opinion that said, which seemed to be favored by the Gemara, that it could potentially. And then we said it's because we no longer know exactly what day it is. And what about the people who do, people living in Israel who know exactly what day the holiday comes out? Well, we basically don't want to create that some people are doing things one way and other people are doing things other ways, even though we know that in many cases this does happen. And therefore we said, because in Babylonia they don't, also in Israel they don't. To which the Gemara said, well, what about Lulav? Why do we make this distinction, which was the distinction the Gemara made yesterday, that in Israel it would override Shabbat and outside of Israel it wouldn't? To which they concluded, also there it doesn't. And that's why we get our custom today that nobody takes a lulav even when the first day of Yantif falls out on Shabbat. Rashi, by the way, uses the language. It's a very common language. If you look at the top of the daf, liditu nami lo dache. Also them in Israel, they don't. It doesn't override. Shelo la'asot Yisrael agudot. We don't want to create groups of people each doing different things, right? And the v'nir'eh k'shtei torot, and it looks like there's two different tracks going on here. Now they say the elakashya hanetarte, but what about the Mishnayot that we said before? One talks about everyone brought their lulavim to the shul, and one says they all brought them to the Temple Mount. So we said must be they brought it to the Temple Mount when the temple was around. They brought it to the shul when the Temple Mount wasn't around, and that was on Shabbat. Seems like even when there is no temple, it overrides Shabbat. So that's why they're going to say the elakashya hanetarte the tanachada. Because in one place it says, one Mishnah said they bring it all to the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. And we answered, so, right, one was when there was a temple, one where there wasn't a temple, seems like it would override. So they say, no, you can give a different explanation, which is exactly how we explained the Mishnayot back then. Lo idi bisman shebeit hamikdash kayam v'lo kashya kan b'mikdash kan b'gvulin. Both are in the time when the temple's around. It's just not a debate. One is in the temple. Those who are planning to go to the temple would bring them to the temple. And then remember, the rabbi said, well, no, leave your lulav at home. Don't bring it to the temple. Kan b'gvulin. And the other one is outside of the temple. Anyone who wasn't going to the temple, I would assume this seems to indicate the people who didn't make it to Israel for Aliyah LaRegel or didn't make it to Jerusalem, specifically for Aliyah LaRegel, for going up for the Mambu holiday, they would bring it to the Beit HaKnesset. And there, remember, there wasn't as much danger. There weren't as many people. It wasn't as chaotic. And therefore, that's the distinction. Amar le'Abaye leRava. Ma'ishna lulav de'avdina le'shiv'a zecher le'mikdash, u'ma'ishna Rava de'lo avdina le'shiv'a zecher le'mikdash. But wait. When do we take Arava? Let's just go back to our minhag. We talked about Hoshanu, which seemed to be connected to Arava, although no one's really talked about Hoshanu yet specifically here. I want to just point that out. Okay, so now the mitzvah of Arava again was every day they would they would put standing up Aravot around the altar. Okay, and then they would encircle it one time, holding something, which we saw there was a debate, were they holding lulavim or were they holding Aravot? So now, right, which sounds very much like our Hoshanot, but it seems like this institution of Hoshanot wasn't really in existence the way we know it to be at that point. And it says here, Amar le'Abaye leRava, I don't understand. Why is Lulav, after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, they instituted, we're going to continue the mitzvah of Lulav all 7 days to remember Zecher LeMikdash, remember Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Umayshna Arava, but what about Arava? Dilov dina lashiv'a zecher lemikdash. Nobody puts Aravot around an altar. Obviously, we don't have an altar, but at least according to those who say they held an Arava, right? That they took them in their hands. So we only do that. When do we take Aravot? Only on the seventh day. right? After we finish our Hoshanot, we pick up our avot. We even smack them on the floor. We'll talk about that soon. Why don't we do that all 7 days? Why only one day? So Amar leho Adam yitzei yedei chovato b'arava shebelulav. So Rava answers him. Actually, I think it should be Rabba. Yeah, it should be Rabba. Rabba answers him and says, no, it's really that because every day you take a lulav and in the lulav are aravot, you fulfill your obligation. So Amar le hahu mishum lulav hu dekavid, but no, that's because of lulav. Okay. If you want to say, maybe you pick up the lulav twice, pick up the lulav every day to fulfill your mitzvah of lulav, then you pick it up a second time to fulfill the mitzvah of arava, and that would be the mitzvah of remembering that they did it in the temple. But we see every day, nobody does that. Nobody picks up their lulav twice, one for lulav and one for arava. So we're a little bit stuck. So Amar Rav Zvi Mishmei de Rava. So he said in the name of Rava, Lulav de Oraita Avdinan Shiva Zecher LeMikdash. Arava de Rabbanan Lo Avdinan La Shiva Zecher LeMikdash. Very simply, Lulav is Torah law. That's why in the temple they took it for 7 days by Torah law, because remember, V'samachtem L'fnei Hashem Elokechem Shivat Yamim. Therefore, they instituted Zecher LeMikdash after the destruction. But Arava, which is not a Torah law, now ding, 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 wait a minute, didn't we see it was? Hold off. Okay, it's not a Torah law. We don't need any reminder. So now they say, Liman, according to who you're talking about. Remember what Abba Shaul said? He darshans it directly from the verse. Arvei Nachal is plural, one for Lulav, one for the temple. It is Deoraita. Ila Rabbanan, who said, Hilchata Gemira, they said it's halacha l'mosh misinai. Now, halacha l'mosh misinai, it seems clear from this text, has a status almost of Torah law. It's as if it was written in the Torah, because we believe it was passed down to Moshe at Sinai, even if we don't say it's exactly, but it's definitely a very early custom. It's very close to Torah law. So if that's the case, right, how do we know this? That was his name. He came from Bikat Beit Hortan. Remember those three things. One of them is arava, is halacha l'mosh misinai. So either which way you look at it, it's Torah law basically, and we should have had a zecher lemikdash. So Ela Amar Rav Zvi Mishmei de Rava. So Rav Zvi changes his tone a little bit and says, well, lulav de'ile ikar me'atorah bigvulin, since there's real proof in the Torah that outside of the temple you're supposed to take a lulav 1 day a week. Therefore, avdina le'shiva zecher lemikdash. So then shows how important lulav is after the destruction of the temple. Therefore, they wanted to remember the temple, so they added, another 6 days. But arava delayed la ikar min haTorah bigvulin. But arava doesn't have any basis in the Torah outside of the temple. It was only a mitzvah that they took in the temple, right? And certainly, right, there's no indicator that they took it outside the temple and from the Torah for sure. And therefore, lo avdina and shiva zecher lemikdash. That's why we don't have 7 days to remind us, right? We don't do the arava all 7 days. Amar Rish Lakish. Lakish now brings another halacha about this. Kohanim ba'alei mumim nichnesim ben ha'ulam v'lamizbeach kedei latzei pa'arava. When they would do the arava again, what would they do? They would walk around the altar. Where's the altar? If you walk around the altar, you're going to end up going into the space that's between the ulam and the mizbeach. If you remember our maps from Masechet Yoma, so you walk into the temple from the east side, you walk into the area that's first Ezra Yisrael. That's where regular people can go. But Kohanim ba'alei mumim are not allowed. If you're a blemished Kohen, you're not allowed to pass that line. Can't go in there. So first you have Ezra Yisrael, then you have Ezra Kohanim. The Kohanim can go there if they're not actually working. They can still go to that line. Then you have the altar. Then you have the space that's between the altar and the ulam. The ulam is the hallway that leads into the sanctuary, right? The more you go into the room westward, the more sanctified it gets. So now when you go into that room, when you go beyond, if you're going to circle the altar, you're going to end up on the side, bein ulam lemizbeach. Now, forget the ba'alei mumim aren't allowed in this area at all. For sure, they shouldn't be allowed to go right where the sanctuary is, almost right the entrance to the entranceway into the sanctuary. So he says this interesting halacha that they're allowed to do it, which seems to indicate that he thinks it's a mitzvah for all Kohanim to be part of this arava mitzvah. And he thinks that it overrides the prohibition for the blemish Kohen to be in that area. Some people say the prohibition is only rabbinic, in which case it becomes easier to say this, because the mitzvah of arava min Torah is more important than the forbidden on a rabbinic level to go into that area. But some people say it's actually deoraita. It's by Torah law, it's forbidden for them to go. And then you would have to say the mitzvah aseh of arava overrides the mitzvah lo taseh of not going into the temple area. So either which way it overrides. There's some who provide even other explanations, but we'll stick with that. So now we're going to say, so he says they can go kedei latzei barava. So Amarle Rabbi Yochanan, mi amara, who said that? So the Gemara says, mi amara, ha-ew. What do you mean, who said this? First of all, he himself said it, Rabbi Yochanan. How so? Da'amar Rabbi Asi, amar Rabbi Yochanan, mishum Rabbi Nechunya ish bik'at beit Hortan, eser nitiyot arava v'nisuch hamayim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. If arava is this halacha l'Moshe miSinai, must be very important. So what do you mean, who said? Now, first of all, it's a little bit weird, because just because you say it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai doesn't mean you think the Baalei Mumim, blemish Kohanim can go there. But Rashi explains that what they really thought was that he was against this idea of arava in general. Right? Let me just look at Rashi. He says, Miyamara. So Rashi and Miyamara, it's many lines earlier in the Rashi. Right now, the Gemara thinks, or when they ask this question, that he said, Miyamara shehi chova. How do we know that it's obligatory? And that was his question, to which they say, what do you mean? You're the one who said it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So now they explain his question better. And they say, Ella, mi amara b'nitila, dilma b'skifa. Number one, he was asking, who says you have to carry the arava? Meaning, right, what did you do? You carry the arava when you went or walked around the altar. Maybe b'skifa, maybe the whole mitzvah is just to put up the arava. Now, to do that, you don't need all the kohanim that are blemished to be part of it. If you require walking around, then you want as many people as possible. If you just need the aravo to be placed next to the altar, you just need a kohen to do it. You certainly wouldn't choose a blemished one. Secondly, and just because you say you want a lot of people there, maybe they still have to be unblemished kohanim. It can't be a kohen who has some sort of blemish on his body. So anyway, that's the Rish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan debate about whether Baalei Mumim are allowed. Itmar. Now we're going to have another debate here about arava. Now it's a little bit confusing because we just learned that arava is halacha l'Moshe miSinai, or maybe derived from the Torah, from the word arveh. But now we're going to have a machloket Amoraim, which seems to say it's not really. And we're going to have to rectify this, figure out how this all works. Itmar, it was said, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, they had a debate. Chadamar arava yisod nevi'im. It was something that the Nevi'im established. And that's like something serious, but by the Nevi'im, not by the Torah. V'chadamar aravan minhag Nevi'im. One said it was just a custom that the Nevi'im kind of said, oh, this is a good custom to do, and they upheld it, but not that they established it as something, establishing sounds like it's maybe something more obligatory. Minhag is as a custom to do. Okay, so we have this debate between them. Who says what? We don't know. So now the Gemara is going to say, Tistaim de Rabbi Yochanan hu damar yesod nevi'im. It must be Rabbi Yochanan is the one who said yesod nevi'im. Why? Da'amar Rabbi Avau, amar Rabbi Yochanan, arava yesod nevi'im hu tistaim. Because Rabbi Avau says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that he said it's yesod nevi'im, so it must be he's the one who thinks it was a much more seriously established custom, rather, right, that the nevi'im established this mitzvah, right, this obligation, rather than it's just a custom from their time. Amalei Rabbi Zera Rabbi Avau. But now we're going to have some questions of Rabbi Yochanan. Mi amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi? Did he really say this? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Nechunya ben ish bik'at beit Hortan esel nitiyot arava v'nisuch hamayim halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So how can you say it's yesod nevi'im, even if that's kind of more serious? It's still not halacha l'Moshe miSinai. And he himself said it was halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This doesn't make any sense. That he was silent for a whole hour, and he didn't know how to respond to this question. And then he came up with an answer, and he said, it was halacha l'Moshe miSinai. They forgot it, and came the Nevi'im, and they reinstituted it. Okay? So now, the assumption is, who forgot it? Well, they say, Shchachum begalut Bavel, shachachu et haTorah, Rashi says, b'mitzvot b'miktzat, v'zo nishkacha legamrei. Sometimes they forgot some things in the Torah when they went to Babylonia in exile, and this one was completely forgotten. What the rabbis did was reestablish the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We saw this recently with another halacha l'Moshe Sinai that was completely forgotten and reinstituted based on some of the opinions we mentioned there. That's a little difficult because some people say halacha l'Moshe Sinai is something that there's never a machloket about, and it's something that there's never a break. It was constant. So this kind of breaks that theory a little bit, as did the previous case. So now they say, but still we have a problem because that assumes that when they went to Babylonia, they forgot a lot of Torah. But mi amar Rabbi Yochanan, hachi, did he really say this? V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, dilchun amrei dilhonhi. Okay, what does this mean? So what he said is, I thought that dilchun amrei, I thought that we in Israel have the better tradition. It was dilchoni, it was a dilchon amrei. We say it all right, but I learned by we'll see in a minute how, dilhonhi, that really the Babylonians have the Torah much better than us. They've managed to preserve the tradition much better than the ones in Israel did. Okay, how does he know this? So Rashi says, he tells a story that, and if you look at the last Rashi on the page, Ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan dilchun amrei dilhonhi, Rav Kahana hayami talmidei Rav, and he was charif ma'od, he was a great student, he was a student of Rav, and he was from Babylonia. Ubarach le'eretz Yisrael lifnei Rabbi Yochanan mipnei mardim shaharag la'adam echad. Apparently he killed somebody and he had to run away. Comes up in Bava Kama. So wait till we get there, you'll see the story. Or you can look it up if you want. It's on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin in Bava Kama if you can't wait till a few years from now. Rabbi Yochanan had a bunch of questions. He started asking them. And then when he realizes how smart Rav Kahana is, he realizes that, you know what, they must be keeping the tradition better than us. So basically, how can you say that in Babylonia, when they went to exile, they lost the tradition and then the Nevi'im reinstituted it? How could you say that when he said it's clear the Babylonians have the right tradition and we're not as good about it? So the Gemara answers, lo kashya, kam b'mikdash, kam b'gvulin. When he says it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, what he meant is halacha l'Moshe Sinai in the temple. And when they talked about Yesod Nevi'im, he was talking about outside the temple, and that resolves all our issues. In the temple, that's what we're going to do. But outside the temple, right, that's because of either Torah or halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Outside the temple, we're going to keep this custom going. That's either what the Nevi'im, the prophets, established, or it's possibly, right, it's just a custom from the time of the prophets. So Amar Rabbi Ami, now we're going to talk about this Arava. Amar Rabbi Ami, Aravat tzricha shiur, ve'ena nitelet ele b'fnei atzma. It needs a certain requisite amount, and it's only taken by itself, meaning you don't take it with anything, you don't bind it, okay, you just take it. And you can't use the arava and the lulav to fulfill your obligation of arava. So now they say, it is only taken by itself. Obviously, then you're not going to fulfill your obligation with the arava and the lulav. So why, if you already said it has to be taken by itself, then obviously you can't use the one in the lulav. So they say, well, why did they say this? You might have thought it has to be taken by itself. That means you can't just shake the lulav once and think you fulfill your obligation that way. But if you were to maybe take it twice, it would be okay. And therefore, it comes to tell you, no. Therefore, it says you can't fulfill your obligation with the Rav and the lulav so that you don't make that mistake. Rav Chisda disagrees, and the name of Rav Yitzchak, he says you could fulfill your obligation by holding the arava in the lulav, right? This would save people a lot of money on Hoshana Rabbah, right? When all these people are selling arava for crazy amount of money, right? When they really cost nothing. And everybody has to go buy their 5 arava leaves, which, by the way, you're going to have to research because 5, we're going to see, does not appear in the Gemara. Okay, it seems to be a Kabbalistic influence, I believe. I didn't have enough time to research it. Maybe by tomorrow I will. So now they say, according to them, you could actually use your Arav and your Lulav, and then you wouldn't have to buy all these extra Aravot on Hoshana Rabbah. The Kama Shiura, and what's the amount? I'm passing over the words in parentheses. How much? Amar Rav Nachman, Gimel Badei Alim Lachim, 3 stalks of moist leaves. Rav Sheshet Amar, Afilu Ale Echad Ubad Echad. Even 1 stalk and 1 leaf, or it should be 1 leaf and 1 stalk. So the Gemara says, Ale Echad Ubad Echad Salkadatach. What, you think, take 1 leaf and then another stalk? It meant even if you have 1 stalk with only 1 leaf on it, that's sufficient. So we either have 1 with even 1 leaf, or we have 3 with moist leaves, right? But notice 5 doesn't appear here, even though now our mitzvah is 5. Amar Aivu. Aivu says, okay, he was the teacher of Rav. The father of Rav. Amar Aivu. Hava ka'imna kamei Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Okay, I was before Elazar bar Tzadok. And he says, "Va'aite hahu gavra arava kameh." Happened to be the Shemitah year, and somebody brings an arava in front of him. Oh, sorry, no, we're getting into Shemitah soon. My mistake. Someone brings an arava in front of him. Shakil chavit v'lo barich. He took it. Now, chavit, usually we call choftim arava means to hit it. So either some people say it means to hit, other people say it means to wave. He waved it or he hit it twice. Okay, velo berech, and he didn't make a blessing on it. Now, why would you make a blessing, or why wouldn't you? Must be kasavar minhag neviim, who it must be he thought it was only a custom. A custom, you don't generally make a blessing. A mitzvah, right? If you say it's yesod neviim that they instituted something, then maybe you would make a blessing. Now, what blessing could you make? The rabbis institute something, right? Normally we say on a mitzvah, asher kedushan mitzvah tzivanu. However, we do have a whole bunch of mitzvot that the rabbis instituted, for example, Megillah on Hanukkah and, Megillah on Purim and lighting candles on Hanukkah, where we do say, Asher Kedisham Mitzvah Tzivanu. Some people say, where did they command you? Well, there's a commandment in the Torah, Lo Tasur Min Adavar Asher Yagidu Lecha. Don't veer from what the rabbis tell you. So the Asher Kedisham Mitzvah Tzivanu this is what the rabbis commanded us. There's a whole debate, and you can look at Tosfot if you want. There's a whole debate about whether you make a bracha on Halal and Rosh Chodesh. The question is, which minhagim? What is a minhag? Sometimes there is a minhag, like Halal and Rosh Chodesh is just a custom. That's why we skip 2 of the paragraphs, because it's only a custom. It's a mitzvah when it's the chagim and certain other days. But it's a custom on Rosh Chodesh. Really chagim, I guess. I don't think there's other days, but chagim. Now, when it's Rosh Chodesh, it's only a custom. And yet Ashkenazim make a blessing, Sephardim don't. And that's based on exactly this debate here, where the Tosfot says you would make a blessing, okay? Even though it's a custom, you can make a blessing on a custom. The question is, why here in the Gemara do you not? And Tosfot makes a distinction, what's different between this custom and that custom. Anyway, there's more to go on in that vein, but this is a very interesting sugya because the Tosfot here really talks about something very basic, which is bracha and halal that we're very used to, right? Whereas Sephardim would say you don't in general. This is very similar, by the way, to women opting into time-bound commandments, whereas Ashkenazim say yes, and Sephardim, many Sephardi poskim don't allow it. Part of it is dependent on their approach, I would say not to women, but specifically to blessings and using God's name in vain. The Sephardim take it very seriously, not that the Ashkenazim don't take it very seriously, using God's name in vain, but they're a little bit more careful about it in a sense that they're worried that this might be a bracha in vain and therefore don't allow it. Whereas the Ashkenazim say if there is a purpose, then it's not in vain, and then they would allow it. So you see this continuity here between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, both in this again and the other that we discussed the other day. Okay, so now next situation. Aivu v'Chizkiah b'nei Barte de Rav. Okay, now we have Aivu, who is the grandson of Rav. Before it was his father. This is the Aivu, the grandson, and Chizkiah, who is also his grandson. Aitu arava lekamei de Rav. They brought an arava in front of Rav. Chavit v'lo beirech. He did the same thing. He waved it from side to side or smacked it on the floor and didn't make a blessing, right? So, kasavar minhag neviim. We also thought that it was just a custom, and that's why he didn't make a blessing on it. Amar Aivu, another story. This is Ivu, the senior, the father of Rav. This has nothing to do with our situation. It's just that since we had a situation where he saw something happen before Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, they bring another case. And this is in Shemitah year. A random person comes up. Amrle says to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Karyata itle, Karmaya itle, Zaytaya itle. I have villages. I have vineyards. I have olive trees. Now, even though it's the Shemitah year, the people of the village come and they hoe my land. And they eat my olives, and that's their salary for doing it. Arich o lo arich. So now he says, is this okay or is this not okay? So Amar le lo arich. He says, this is no good. You can't feed them in the Shemitah year. You can't be paying them in this way from your crops. Okay, he says, Shabbat ha'aretz lachem la'ochla. You can't pay him with sanctified fruits that are from the Shemitah year. You can't use that to pay somebody. It doesn't work. It has sanctity to it. You can't use it as payment. So what did he do? Havakashavik leva'azil. So he left them. Okay, so now he walked away, and at another point, so he walks off. Sorry, one second. He walks off, and then he says, Amar kado haviti daire ba'arahada mem shanin. Okay, he says, so Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok turns to Ivu and he says to him, listen, I've been living in this land for 40 years. He says, I haven't seen a person like this who goes in the proper way, in the straight path like this guy. In other words, what happened? He was paying them with the olives. He said, eat the olives, that will be your payment. And I said, that's no good. And he immediately changed his ways. He said, that is amazing, right? How many people would do that? Number one, hard for people to change their system and their ways, especially when it comes to business. And number two, it's a huge loss for him. Now he has to go pay them all. So the guy comes back to him. Well, how am I supposed to do this now? I guess he went home and tried to figure out. And then he said, wait a minute. So how can I pay them if I can't pay them with Perot Shvi'it? So Amarle, Afkir Zaytaya Lechashuchaya. He says, first of all, take all your olives and make them hefker, because it's the Shemitah year. You have to make it all ownerless, as anyone can come get them. V'teim Pritaya Lekishkushe Kramim, and then go pay your workers for hoeing the field. Okay, now comes the most important question. Kishkushe Mishare, how are you allowed to hoe the field? How can they be hoeing the field on Shemitah? It's Shemitah year. It's supposed to work the land. V'atanya, doesn't it say in a bright, Shvi'it Shamtenu Unitashta? That's the verse, that the Shvi'it should cancel everything and kind of have to abandon it. So why does it say two words? Tishmatena milikashkesh, meaning you can't hoe. V'unitashta milisakel, and you can't take stones out of. There's stones in your field. It's not good for crops to grow. You're not allowed to take the stones out of your field. And it's besides not planting, plowing, right? These are additional things you're not allowed to do. So how could it be that they did that he hired them to do it? And the rabbi didn't say, stop doing that. So there's two different types of hoeing. Chad situme pile, v'chad avruye ilane. Says there's two different types. Okay, now we'll go through. Ivruye ilana aso, to allow your crops, your trees. Okay, let's start with the first. Situme pile is basically to close up cracks in the ground. To do that, you're allowed to do. But what you're not allowed to do is after that, to start moving around the soil, that's by, right, kind of making some holes in the soil around the roots to have the land be soft, like, tilling the soil, it sounds like. So that you can't do. So it must be that what he was referring to was the situme pile, to cover up the cracks, that's allowed. So ivruye lane asur situme pile shari. Another thing, Amar Ivu, Mishum Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, you shouldn't walk on Erev Shabbos more than 3 parsaot. Okay, meaning don't go traveling too far from home. Now, it's not for the reasons you would think. It's very interesting. Amar Rav Kahana lo amaran ela lebeite, aval ushpize amaydenakit samach. We're worried, what we really don't want is for you to be so far from home that people will think that you're not coming back for Shabbat and they won't cook for you. And then what will happen? It's actually kind of funny. Rashi says, They have no idea if you're coming home. And then you show up. And then they say, oh my goodness, I didn't make any food for you. And then they get angry at you because you didn't let them know. And then they make food, right? This is classic. Imagine, right? Someone wasn't expecting to be home and they think, oh, it's fun, I'll surprise you. And then the person, right, who's running the house gets very upset. Like, I wanted to be prepared. I don't have any food for you. I don't have anything going on, right? So this is a good example of you have to be very careful. But he says if you're going to stay in a hotel somewhere, so the assumption is, right? You have you intend to eat whatever you carry with you. So you're not going to surprise anyone when it comes to food. This is interesting because then Igada Amre, some people say, Amar Rav Kahana, the opposite. Lo netzpo ela afilu lebeitim. Even when you go to your house, of course, when you go to be a guest somewhere, if you didn't let anyone know you were coming, for sure they wouldn't have expected you. At least in your own house, they expect you. But even in your own house, you shouldn't do it because you also, again, you might cause people to get angry with you. But of course, if you're going somewhere where they don't know you and where they're not expecting you to come, they definitely will need to know that you're coming in advance to prepare food for you. So here's the opposite approach. Amar Rav Kahana, here's a great line. Bedidi hava uvda. In fact, this happened to me after he said this whole thing. I had a situation like this where I got home and afilu kasa deharsina lo eshkachai. I couldn't even find the easiest, simplest food to make, which is that fish with some flour on it, fried fish. Even that they didn't have. And, I guess things didn't go well at home. I guess his wife got really angry with him for not letting her know that he was coming home. So anyway, this is food for thought. Right? What comes to my mind is the army, right? The army doesn't always let the parents know, depending on what unit you're in. Sometimes they like to, these higher units, they like to have people be ready for the unexpected. And they never tell the guys whether they're getting out that weekend or they're not getting out that weekend. And then at the last minute, they'll say, oh, by the way, you're going home. And, the family's not expecting, you have a soldier coming home, you got to prepare a lot of food. You could totally see this happening. At least there you could say, number one, it wasn't their fault. They didn't know. And right, you think the army at least would be nice to let the parents know that the kids are coming home so they would know to prepare appropriately and make food for their poor starving army son who's coming home from the army and wants some food, or daughter for that matter, because also daughters are in units where they also play mind games like that. So in any case, this is food for thought. I once had a nephew kind of living in my house most of the time who was in a very serious training course. And I never knew when he was coming for Shabbos or not. And when he would come home, he was so hungry that he would eat a lot of food, so I always had to have lots of extra just in case I would get that call at 2:30 Friday afternoon. Oh, by the way, I'm coming for Shabbat. So anyway, that is my connection to the end of today's daf. And have a great day, everyone. And Shabbat Shalom. On this note of Erev Shabbat.